My name is Sam Bishop, and I am Education Director and Arborist for Trees New York. And Trees New York is a not-for-profit 501c3 that's been working with the New York City Parks Department since 1976 to help care for and prune New York City's street trees. So we like to say we got started, sort of a couple of financial crises ago in response to budget cuts to the Parks Department and some of the tree care things in New York City, and a group of different interested organizations and individuals got together and said, if the Parks Department doesn't have the money to do tree care, particularly for newly planted trees, which are often the trees that need the most care, but strangely get the most neglect, could we do it as volunteers? And so the program was developed from there, and we might be the oldest volunteer pruning program in at least the US. I'm not 100% certain of that, but I know we're certainly one of the older ones, if not the oldest. I myself am an ISA board certified master arborist and municipal specialist. So I'm a sort of an urban tree expert. And I also, in addition to doing that for Trees New York, I teach a pruning class once a year at the New York Botanic Garden, the one in the Bronx. And I've done some other tree related things. I taught a college level urban forestry course at the New School. I was on the board of AC Trees for a while, which is a national level tree organization. So we've done a lot of different things around urban trees. So we wanted to talk tonight about the benefits of urban trees. And we won't cover all of them because there's a lot of them. So I wanted to go a little more into depth on a few of them, as well as give you a couple of tools to help you, one in particular, to help you explore the benefits of urban trees, and particularly actually calculating and quantifying them for yourself. And you may or may not have seen these tools already, so we'll just have to see. So, yep, this is just a little background about what Trees New York does. So on the left side there, that's a bulb planting project we did with some volunteers in some tree beds in East Harlem. In the middle there, I know it looks kind of like they might be planting bulbs too, but that's actually a tree pruning project. We're pruning some root suckers there from a linden tree, and that was in the East Village. And then over on the right there, that is a recent street tree planting project that we did, and that was in Jackson Heights in Queens. So we do a lot of different things, sort of everything with urban forestry all over the city. So I mentioned a tool to help you analyze and look at your urban tree benefits, and this is the tool. Itree. It's actually a whole suite of tools, but the sort of the most user-friendly one is this one. It's called Itree Design, and there's the URL at the top, design.itreetools.org. And what design will do is basically using more or less a map interface like Google Maps. It will let you place a tree on a map, determine benefits from the tree, and then even basically grow that tree through time and look at how the benefits would increase over time. So it's a very nice way to get some quantitative numbers for tree benefits, and in particular, even if it's it can be tree benefits in your neighborhood, even the tree in front of your house. It was an earlier version of this tool that helped convince Mayor Bloomberg in New York City to support and effectively to privately fund, when it came down to it, the Million Trees program, because the Parks Department could then go to the mayor's office and say, using an earlier version of this, and actually calculated how much the city was getting back in benefits from its trees in a dollar amount versus how much relatively less. So it was a very good return that they were paying in costs for the tree, not just for the planting, but for the maintenance and things like that.
And may I ask a question, or questions are later? I'm sorry, I joined a little bit later.
Hey, Rennie, just chat it out and I will try to answer it.
Okay.
And then we'll circle back at the end.
So when you start to use Itree, this is the screen that you would see. And yes, I picked a spot in Jersey City because that's what's relevant to all of you. So I picked just a classic apartment building set up here. You can see you can enter your tree species, the detail for the tree at planting. And then once you've selected and outlined the building, Itree will actually calculate the place where to put your tree that's the less desirable for benefits, and that's the yellow part, that yellow corner, that yellow bit on the bottom of the screen, or more desirable as it gets darker green. And so with this, you can actually sort of strategically think about placing your tree. Now, I realize this looks a little bit odd, and you're thinking, wait, why does that one corner of the building, which is south, so that would get a lot of sun, why does that look like the mapped as the worst place to plant the tree? Because on the south side of the building is good for shade, so it would help cool the building in the summer, but it also means that it would block the sun from hitting the building in the winter, and the building would stay colder. And so you need to use more energy to heat the building. So as counterintuitive as it seems, and especially when we talk a lot of the time about tree benefits, about planting trees for shade and for cooling, sometimes the spot that would seem to shade the building the absolute most is not the most energy efficient place to plant the tree. So in this case, the south side of the building is the least efficient. So looking at the Google Street View for the site and the map, I realized there's an empty tree bed on that corner. So that's where I tried placing the tree. And then this is so you can see here it's placed, it's that green pin. And that kind of blue-green circle around it is the crown growth modeler. So it's modeling what the crown of the tree, all the leaves and the branches together, would look like as you grow it out over whatever the number of years you put in. In this case, I had 30. And so you can see it's about the size of that tree right across from it on the other side of Oxford Avenue. So that gives you an idea that this is probably a pretty accurate estimate. And then for that tree at sort of the first year, the last year, any point along the way, it will also calculate the benefits that the tree is providing you. So in this case, I've got two shown here. You can see there's more in the tabs, but the larger image there, the carbon dioxide. So based on to date, it says your 3-inch Princeton elm, which was the kind of tree I used, it's a very common street tree, has reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide by 403 pounds, and it is estimated to have stored 98 pounds of the CO2 equivalent of carbon. Well, what does all that mean? Reduced atmospheric carbon is not the same thing as stored. Reduced atmospheric carbon takes into consideration both the amount that the tree has directly absorbed through photosynthesis as it grows, but also the amount of energy that the tree has saved and the carbon that would be necessary for that energy. So this is where outlining that building, and there's a few basic pieces of information you can put in about the building that'll help make the model more accurate. But that's where all that comes in. It's helping to calculate that avoided energy cost as well. Energy cost and energy balance. So in this case, about a quarter of that is the carbon that's actually stored in the tree, or the equivalent weight of stored in the tree. And then the other 300 pounds or so is just CO2 that never went into the air from fossil fuels that were never burned because of the benefits from the tree. And just in case anyone's wondering, a good comparison is that when you burn 1 gallon of gasoline, you get about 19 pounds of carbon dioxide, 19 pounds of CO2 from 1 gallon of gasoline. So it's a handy, it's a little more day-to-day comparison than the 300 pounds of CO2. On the right there, you can see some discussion about stormwater, and that's another benefit of trees. That when we have those heavy summer rains, we can get a lot of runoff in urban areas because we've paved over everything with concrete and asphalt and those surfaces that water can't get through. So trees can help with that by directly holding some water on their leaves and their trunk. The cutout, or as we say here, the tree bed that they're in, can absorb some water because it's exposed bare soil. But it only works really well if it's soil in good condition too. If it's very compacted, like squashed down from people stepping on it, then the water just tends to run off. So on that benefit, you can see that's listed that it's calculating the rainwater interception for the tree. So our tree will have intercepted 189 gallons of rainfall. So that's what actually got stuck on the tree, and then it will have avoided 99 gallons of stormwater runoff. So that it is also calculates what was received into the soil. So for air pollution benefits, so I'm sorry, I know it's one of those awful PowerPoint slides with just lots of bullet points and lots of text. I just wanted to put the some of the numbers out there for all of you, and also to make sure the citations for the studies that these things come from are down on the bottom of the slides too. But trees remove air pollutants in 2 major ways. They absorb gases into their leaves, and they have particulate matter that gets stuck on their trunk and on the leaves and then gets washed off later. And don't forget, they avoid some of those by simply never creating a need to burn carbon in the first place to make energy for things like air conditioners or heating. So the gaseous pollutants that can be removed include nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, all 3 from burning fossil fuels, and contribute to various urban air pollution. There's also particulate matter. And particulate matter is very, very small particles of something. So if you've ever seen, like at least here in Manhattan, we still have some buildings that have very old boilers that basically run on the fuel oil equivalent of, like, you know, the stuff out of the La Brea tar pits. And every time they start up, there is this huge, awful cloud of black smoke, and that is particulate matter. So it's very fine, either basically soot or unburned particles. Anything that generates dust can cause particulate matter. So the other sources include tire dust, just literally tiny pieces of rubber, and brake dust from the metal, from the brake shoes and the metal brakes slowly wearing away. Depending on the study, some have found that trees can capture up to 50% of peak time peak travel time, I should say, so that's rush hour. Particulates. How much varies a lot based on the layout of the trees, the site, and even the kinds of trees that are there. And since it is the middle of the winter, I should also add that trees that don't have leaves on them, obviously, if the particulates are getting caught on the leaves and there's no leaves, there's no catching particulates. So their particulate capture goes way down. So thinking about particulate capture, evergreens and conifers, trees that have needles, often are better choices if that's something that you're really worried about. But you sometimes hear this, and I figured I should explain it to you. Trees can, in some cases, make air pollution worse. And I know that seems like a very odd statement coming from somebody who works for a place called Trees, New York. But what can happen in a few situations is they can trap already existing air pollution down at street level so that it doesn't get dispersed, so that you have, in essence, this cloud of air pollution down near the street. So typical place you'd see it would be in a sort of urban canyon like this, and you get wind over the top of it. That's what my blue arrow is supposed to indicate. And then that wind, as it blows over the top of the buildings, can actually create a vortex within the canyon that either blows the pollution out or even just lifts it up. But if you have trees, like you can see here, sometimes what will happen is all those leaves and all the irregular surface of the tree will reduce the speed of or stop that vortex from forming, and then you don't get as much pollution removal. Now, of course, if you said, yeah, Sam, this is great, but the real problem is that the pollution's there in the first place. Yes, I agree with you, but we're stuck with the vehicles we have for the time being. So it is a consideration, and it's at least something to understand in these cases and keep an eye out for. So ozone reduction. So you've probably seen those ozone alert days. And ozone is basically just a reactive form of oxygen, but breathing it in, unfortunately, it reacts with your respiratory passages in your lungs and can do damage to people. It can certainly irritate sensitive individuals and probably irritates everybody. So ozone forms when nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds react in the presence of ultraviolet light, basically sunlight, and form ozone, at least ozone as it's formed outside. Higher temperatures and UV levels in the summer just result in more ozone formation. The nitrogen oxides and the carbon monoxide, the primary source of those is fossil fuels. In the case of most cities, you're talking about vehicular traffic. And then if we can cool the urban environment even by a couple of degrees with trees by shading, so we don't have that urban heat island effect, we'll talk about that in a minute, we can reduce that formation of ozone, because remember, the higher the temperature, the faster and the more ozone forms. Now, there's kind of a catch-22 here on trees, and that's ozone creation. So trees and plants emit volatile organic, those same VOCs, those precursors, at high temperatures. And they can comprise a pretty big component of the urban sources of VOCs. But some of that is very much avoidable with species selection. For some particular trees or plants that produce more ozone, and we know there are others that produce, not more ozone, more VOCs. And we know that there are others that produce less. So it's probably going to be one of the things we're going to start to factor for in a big way in urban forestry coming up, is just VOC production amongst our tree populations. I know I have a little note there, but the University of California, their Agriculture and Natural Resources Division, their publication 8484 is available online and is excellent on trees and ozone, and has lists of generally high and generally lower VOC emitting trees. So trees for cooling. Trees cooling in two different ways. We'll talk about sort of the more obvious one first, and that is just they shade things. And of course, we've got in the city, we have the urban heat island effect, and that's where the sun shines on all our built surfaces. So concrete, asphalt, brick, metal, whatever it may be, all those surfaces heat up and then they store that heat and then they re-release it. So the city gets hot and stays hot. The difference can be pretty extreme. In areas that got part shade and part sun, surface temperatures were found to be 12 degrees cooler than areas that got full sun. And in areas that were in permanent shade, they were up to 20 degrees cooler. So one of the challenges that we have in cities is not just that we have that initial gain of heat from urban heat island effect, but then we also don't radiate the heat very effectively. So in this picture, like kind of a building out in the country, and I know it's a ghost town, the best I could find. Most of that heat that all those surfaces absorb, so the building, the wrecked trucks there, oops, sorry about that, can escape back into space. You can see how much of this can see, and that's where that heat is going to go. There's relatively little areas where, say, the ground might radiate the heat back to the building and vice versa. So you can see between the part where it says building and ground there's one little set of arrows radiating back and forth. In urban environments, though, we have obviously the reverse of that. There's relatively little sky to see. So there's not a lot of places for the heat to re-radiate that it doesn't just get reabsorbed by another one of those built surfaces in the city. So the other way that trees and plants cool is evapotranspiration. And that is where, as we know, they are absorbing water from the soil and it gets evaporated from their leaves. And as they do that, they draw heat from the surrounding environment to evaporate that water. And that has a cooling effect on everything around them. So you'll distinctly see areas that have more trees and green spaces stay cooler in the summer. Oh, I'm sorry, the slide's advancing itself again. At any rate, here's the slide we were going to. So this is a Landsat image of New York City. And you can see that the more pink an area has, or even in some cases to purple, if you look at the in the very midtown Manhattan there, that shows more built areas, versus the green is areas that are trees, grass, things like that. Now, in particular, you'll note down there in the lower right corner, I've got that orange box around Floyd Bennett Field, which is now a park, but used to be an airport. So that's an area where you can see you've got a lot of green space around these distinct lines of the old runways there. Whereas you look at to the right of that, you think you can see where JFK is on the other side of the bay there, and that has pretty much all pink and just a few tiny little spots of green. So you've got much more pavement and much more heat absorption going on there. And then this is looking at land surface temperatures of those areas. So once again, there's Floyd Bennett Field outlined in purple, and you can see how much cooler that is than JFK on the other side, which has those bright red spots and things like, and areas like that. In the middle of Manhattan, right kind of top center there, you can also see that yellow rectangle is, of course, Central Park, so much cooler than the surrounding area. There were a lot of psychological benefits of trees too. Interestingly, because of COVID-19 and basically the whole world having to stay home at the same time, there's a huge pool of ongoing research and papers in process right now that are going to be examining the importance of green spaces for their various psychological benefits in those stressful situations. So the literature on this is about to expand rapidly in the next year or two. But some of the known benefits include improvements in stress and relaxation, both as reported by people in the study and using some physiological markers. So things like testing for cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and testing people's stress hormone levels. You can see there's all kinds of different benefits here. One study found a 25% increase in neighborhood canopy was associated with a 1-point decrease on a 5-point scale of depression, stress, and anxiety. So that's where you're almost trading, you know, a 25% increase for a 1 on 5 is a 20% improvement. You know, that's almost a 1-to-1 percentage improvement there. In another study, you found that adults in South Korea who decreased visits to green space in response to COVID had about twice the odds of experiencing major depression as those who visited green space the same amount or more. Now, some of this is a little bit hard to sort out because of causality and things. And again, I think that next wave of papers will make the benefits even clearer. But we know that trees and green spaces have a lot of important psychological benefits for people. We should mention also tree disservices, which is sort of the technical term for stuff that trees do that is kind of a problem, or that, you know, we often think is something that has to be fixed. So what are things like tree disservices? That can be things like leaf cleanup or fruit cleanup if the tree drops something like acorns or some other kind of fruit. Sidewalk damage from roots, VOC emissions, which we talked about, the potential of property damage from broken or falling branches or trees. Coordinated government departments can sometimes result in fines to individuals being generated by public trees. I have that in there because I was thinking of a specific case that I dealt with here, but it's certainly something that, you know, all of you, if you wind up stewarding trees, you may wind up hearing about from the public when you're out and about doing that. And maintenance and removal costs for the trees, whether they're direct to a particular site or homeowner, or whether they're indirect and paid through something like taxes. For example, I found this fascinating, but in Portland, Oregon, you can't get a street tree unless you're willing to pay for the tree and pay for all the maintenance on the tree through its whole life. So it's really a different model than we have in New York City, where the tree is free, and where at least a fairly good but a basic level of maintenance comes from the city, also for free. All right, so there's my contact information in case anyone has any questions. Oh, and I'm sorry, I realized I didn't put the our website in there, but it's there. It's basically there in the email, treesny.org. So pretty easy to remember. And just before we dive into questions and everything, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight to hear about some of the benefits of trees, and also for your hard work for Jersey City's trees and its environment.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
There were a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to go through them in order, I believe, and then after that, we can take live questions too if people have them. So Rennie said, actually, let me share my screen. Hold on. Rennie asked, what are your thoughts on porous pavement, which is used in tree pits in a lot of urban high traffic areas? We've definitely seen it used in Jersey City, around the downtown area. I've seen it several times. I think both in an application that it's, I believe, meant to be used in, and then some that it's not, where it's kind of put right up against the tree. But
yeah, no.
What are your thoughts on porous pavement, I guess, in general?
I'm a fan of it. Depending on the product, there might be different levels of maintenance. And you do have to work with the companies to make sure you're selecting the right product for the right space. There were some porous pavements that are more like a rubberized compound, and those tend not to wear well if you've got vehicle traffic on them. I know this because there was one pilot study that was done in New York City with a couple of different porous pavements in one parking lot, and they were having that problem, was that the rubberized porous pavement was wearing a lot faster than some of the more like concrete based ones. But generally, yeah, I'm very much a fan of them wherever they can be used.
Okay, interesting. Now, how far should it be held off of the tree? I think we came across something that recommended about a foot, I think, something like that. Does that make sense to you?
Well, remember, trees grow in soils in the forest, and that's where they want to grow. So porous pavement it's a compromise position between the worst of a sidewalk and the best you could possibly do for a tree, which is no paving at all. You know, so it's given the choice, I would rather see something like a sidewalk with large tree beds, say 5 by 10, like the Parks Department does in New York City, or even, you know, even bigger continuous beds where it's maybe like 5 by 50 feet or 60 feet, and you've got, you know, 3 trees in there, and then around them you that's where you need paving. That's where you've got your porous paving.
Interesting. Yeah, we've seen a bunch of beds here where they just pave right up. They put the porous pavement right up to the tree, and now several have died, I know, in downtown, I'm sure, because of that. It just seems like they just don't know how to install it, I guess, the contractors installing it.
Yeah. Sometimes that's a problem, or it's a more conventional contractor, and they've just been handed this new material and they don't understand it yet.
Yep, understood. Okay, Ablash asked, should tree beds have flowers planted in them? Would they sap up the nutrients meant for the tree like the weeds would?
Oh, Ablash, that is an excellent question. And the answer is a little bit nuanced, but generally, yes, plant your tree beds. Because when you think about trees in the forest, they don't grow in just the forest soil, and it's just the trees and nothing else. There's all kinds of other different plants and fungi and everything in the soil. And that soil is an ecosystem. And the more things in the ecosystem, generally the healthier they tend to be. So yeah, definitely go ahead and plant in them. The one caveat I would say is that, especially for a relatively newly planted tree, yes, there can be competition between the flowers or whatever you've got planted in the bed and the tree for nutrients. Excuse me, not nutrients. Really, water is the big concern there. So you want to make sure that if you're doing that, that you're able to water those plants and the tree. Incidentally, trees' roots spread so far that after a couple of years, those tree roots will be out of the bed and so far under the concrete wherever they can find water that they're not really in competition with the things in the bed anymore.
Gotcha. Interesting. Another question: do larger canopy trees provide more benefits than trees with narrower canopies?
Yes. Most of a tree's benefits come from what's called canopy cover. So the bigger the tree and the bigger the canopy, the bigger the benefits.
Okay, gotcha. And then actually, I wanted this too. The University of California source. It was the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Was it document 8484, something like that?
Yeah, publication 8484.
Publication 8484. Okay.
If you just search for that, you'll find it.
Gotcha. Just on Google or something?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Okay, interesting. Anyone else have any other questions for Sam, for anyone here?
Tree diversity.
Yeah, I mean, in Jersey City, we see a lot of streets where, they planted the same type of tree at the same time, all the way down this, multiple blocks or, one long block. So it's the same tree species and also the same like height, because it's about the same age and everything. I don't know. I think that's probably true for most cities. But obviously there's, maybe some worries about tree diversity there.
Yeah. It's kind of more and more of a problem, especially as we run it, we face ever more pests and diseases. Particularly right now, I don't know how much you're dealing with it there or what Jersey City is doing about it, but emerald ash borer, which at least in New York City, we didn't have that many ash street trees, so it wasn't that big a deal, but it's almost 100% fatal to them. And it's the Parks Department is putting on a huge effort to preventatively treat all the trees that are in decent shape above a certain size, and then the trees that were already in bad condition, they're basically just letting go. But that means they're going to have to be doing large numbers of trunk injections every probably 2 to 3 years. I always like to see trees, on a block mixed up in terms of species and diversity. Sometimes that's not always possible within reason, but the other reason is that when you have a long line of trees, and especially the same tree all planted together, eventually their roots underground find each other, and they actually can start to what's called root graft, where their roots will grow together and they become friends. And this has the advantage that the trees can then begin to grow as one plant, not a group of separate trees. So they can pass sugars, energy, to one of the trees if, like, say, it gets particularly attacked by a pest or disease. But the problem is that they can also share diseases through root grafts. And if you've got, and if you have a new pest or a new disease, if they're all the same thing, if one's vulnerable to it, they're all vulnerable to it.
Very interesting. Okay. So actually, John messaged me a question. fruit trees versus other trees or conifers, are there benefits and or applications to each, I guess, within an urban environment?
Yes, there's sort of advantages and disadvantages to all of the above. Conifers, obviously, you've got that improvement in removing air pollution, and that's a big advantage. The disadvantage with conifers is that depending on what you have, sort of the more classic ones we think of, like pine trees, spruce, fir, they drop cones, and they also tend to drip a lot of sap, even from, from wounds, from woodpeckers, from insects, things like that. So if you're parked on, someone's parked under it, or the tree is next to their house and they're getting a lot of sap dripping on their roof or on their, on their porch or on their car, that can become a big issue for them. And then, of course, the dealing with the cones. If you think of the shape of conifers too, they're usually branched way down low and they're widest at the bottom, which doesn't always fit real well in cities, so you have to be thoughtful about where you put them. Fruit trees, the biggest problem that we run into with fruit trees is the fruits falling from the tree, and then if they don't get picked up, they get squashed and they become both the potential pest attractor and so rats, insects, and they can be a very serious tripping hazard. I know it's not a tree that most people are familiar with, but I can tell you that an American persimmon at the New York Botanic Garden almost did me in one day when I accidentally stepped on one of the fruits.
Okay, so Rennie says New York City is planting a lot of honey locust trees. Is that their preferred tree, the tree of the year, I guess, or?
It's one of them. They're just very tough, and they tend to do well, or at least not badly. And we have a lot of experience with them, so we sort of know what to expect. Parks Department has been working very hard to diversify the pool of trees that are out there. But because honey locust has been so popular for so long, it's also one of the things that there's just a lot of out there in the first place.
Okay. A question about the tree of heaven and the lanternfly. Do we think we should be removing these trees?
As to me, I'm assuming the question means, and please correct me if I'm wrong, removing tree of heaven as a way to stop or reduce the spread of spotted and lanternfly. The problem is that that's not going to work because they have such a broad what's called host range. They'll attack a huge number of different trees. That's why at this point no one's even trying to really fight spotted lanternfly. It's about learning how to live with it. And unfortunately in this case, yeah, if they had a really narrow what we call host range, like those I mentioned before, the emerald ash borer, that only attacks ash trees. So in some of the areas where it went through and it killed all the ash trees early on in its spread in the country, they're now beginning to replant ash trees in those areas because it's so devastated the population that it's starved itself out. So they're doing some experimenting with replanting and seeing, can you replant sort of well behind these spreads of particularly dangerous pests, and how well does that work?
Fascinating. Rennie asks about native trees. Do you guys recommend planting native trees? I guess specifically in this urban environment.
Yeah, with restrictions, I mean, one of the things we have to remember is that, you know, our native trees were adapted to New York City and the New York area before people got here and paved over everything and built buildings. So not every native tree necessarily does well in urban environments anymore. And obviously it's just a complete waste of money, energy, and a surprisingly large pool of carbon from burning all the fossil fuels involved to plant a tree somewhere that just dies on you. So we like to do natives when we can, but we also have to balance that with there's not that many natives, unfortunately, that make really good street trees. And I should add to this, not to get too into the weeds, but there's even kind of a fight now about how native is native. You know, does it have to be something that would have grown in that exact spot and soil type or somewhere in the county or state? You get the idea.
Yep. You can, yeah, I'm sure you can go down a rabbit hole there.
Oh.
All right. Anybody, any other questions? Some of these were great. These were great. Kentucky coffee tree.
Oh yeah, one of my favorites. It's we just found out we're gonna be doing a project coming up. It's gonna be 5 trees in a row in a very industrial area, and I'm thinking in part because of the site requirements, because there's a lot. It's basically going to be along where there's a lot of trucks that park. So I've got to get something that doesn't have a wide spread of limbs because they'll all just get smashed. And I'm thinking coffee tree, and if we can find them, because they're hard to find, maybe catalpa, because it's a tree that has these very, very large heart-shaped leaves, but that makes them very good at reducing pollution too. But, and yeah, Kentucky coffee tree is one of those trees that you do hear debates about, like, is it native or not?
Interesting. We actually, so I knew this name, Rennie, we actually mapped one in, there's one in, what park is this? Bayside Park. We mapped one over the summer. That's how I knew that name. I'd never seen one before though.
Yeah. Oh, we've got them all over the place in New York City now.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Okay, what about commercial districts where businesses worry about their signage visibility and don't want trees? What would you recommend? And do you often have to recommend something to them, I guess, or do you encounter that a lot?
Yeah, it definitely happens. Particularly when Million Trees started, the New York City Parks Department sort of decided to take a harder line on this and said that it's our street, it's our tree beds, it's our trees. We're going to put in what we need for the environmental benefits. That was just the politics in New York City at the time. I realized that model does not work in a lot of places. In terms of signage visibility, you know, I think what we're looking at then is asking ourselves, you know, where are the signs? How big are the signs? Do the trees need to be narrow to be seen between the signs? Do they need to be short so the signs you can see the signs over them? Or even in some cases, do we need something where the canopy starts high up in the tree so that the sign can be seen under most of the canopy? You know, so it's figuring out exactly what you need for that visibility, and then from there it's kind of matching the tree to that. If it was like an over the canopy, I would say, I mean, there's a lot of smaller ornamental trees. You're just not going to get that much canopy out of them, but you know, any canopy is better than none at all. If you needed you know, if you needed taller trees, it's something where you could get the canopy up higher so that the signs could be visible, like between the trunks. Again, Kentucky coffee tree is really good for that. maybe Zelkova, if you could find ones that were branched high enough. Depending on like the size of the tree, a pin oak might work for that too, if everybody could just, if you could prune the lower branches off aggressively, and the stores could be a little patient about it. It's sort of one of those questions I'd have to answer on site.
Actually, Rennie, do you want to talk about the some of the issues you had up on up in your area?
Yes. Yes. Hi. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Thank you, Sam. This was very nice. I actually sit in Jersey City on the Shade Tree Committee. I just joined in June, so I'm always myself learning a lot, but we do have common goal to make our city, Jersey City, greener and more beautiful, and just having more trees is, one way to achieve this. We are not in a great place yet in Jersey City, so this is, very helpful to help spread the word, of the importance of the trees. And so my kind of question was, we had a very particular project in one of our neighborhoods in a business district, where there have been about 70 existing ginkgos planted, because they're great urban trees and they also look beautiful if they're in the right places. But in this particular district, they actually are not doing well. They're not thriving. They're like on the main corridor, on the main street, on the main business street. So when the renovation project came up, we had opportunity to include another 80 trees. But some of the decision makers were really pushing for ginkgo trees to keep planting them. And the Shade Tree Committee, really was recommending against, the monoculture of one single tree species because it's unhealthy, but also because they were not, thriving like that. And, many opponents of this idea was, well, no, we need to have a single, it's just continue with ginkgo trees. So there was a lot of debate, in the public, where we, try to diversify with Zelkova trees or, honey locust trees, just kind of like, break it up a little bit, because we were talking about 14, 15 blocks, really long stretch each way, a mile, one way, north to south, and south to north, another mile. So I was wondering what, many of the proponents of ginkgos, they come back to the idea they're extremely hardy, urban trees, they're doing so great. But in this particular neighborhood, they're actually not doing that good. So I was wondering what your thoughts are. That's why I was asking about diversity, diversifying, and the businesses had a lot to say in the decision-making process, because they didn't want anything that will block their signage. So they selected ginkgo biloba, that it has kind of narrower canopy and just grows really slowly. And this was a concern for us, because we need something with more shade creating and better canopy, and also a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to create that kind of boulevard effect. When you walk, there's more shade and more beauty. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about ginkgos in particular, and what would you recommend? And thank you.
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack in that question. A part of my concern would be, like, if you've got ginkgos of all things that aren't growing well, I'd want to get someone in and maybe do a little more investigation as to why those ginkgos aren't doing well. And I mean, there could be any number of different things. I won't, belabor it with all the different stuff, but it would be important to check, because if there's some other practice that's causing those tree problems, no matter what you put in is going to be subject to that practice or that problem. There's no way around it, and then you'll have more trees that are performing poorly. Now, that being said, particular trees, and this is business district. So I'm imagining it's like your typical probably 10, 12 foot high shop front, and the signs on the top of that.
Yes. So I think, one of the problem with the ginkgo trees is that, we had many mature trees that have been planted about 20, 30 years ago. And because they're not doing so well, they've been cut down and replaced with ginkgos. So our concern was they're growing so slowly that they will never catch up, you know, on that canopy. So that's why we wanted to bring something. Even Kentucky coffee tree can be, you know, maybe a better tree, or Zelkova tree, or again, you know, the honey locust, something that, you know, grows a little bit faster, so that we have that, you know, cooling.
Yeah. Honey locust would be a good choice. Kentucky coffee tree again. And with Kentucky coffee tree, you want to make sure you're getting. They normally have with the honey locust, you want to make sure you're getting the one that doesn't have the pods and the thorns, which is kind of the standard urban one. But
is it okay? So there's a variety, because that was one of the concerns of the pods, you know, staining sidewalks and making mess.
Yeah.
So there is a possibility. That's great.
Yeah. The Kentucky coffee tree, there is now a pod-free one too. There's one that I think one of the cultivars, I think, is espresso, that does not have that has very few or no pods. Oaks would probably be right out because of acorns. That probably.
But I think what was very interesting, what I learned today, something very new, was the trees of the same species, they communicate through roots.
Yep.
And you use a terminology which I didn't catch. Grass.
Sorry.
Grass.
Root graft.
Root graft.
Graft.
Okay. So that's another reason why we should not be planting so many ginkgos, because they can start creating root graft.
You can get into the situation where if one, not that ginkgos have many diseases, but like none, but you know, if you had a problem with one, it can spread to the others through root grafts. Zelkovas might be a good choice for your street if you can get ones that are that have the branches high enough up on the tree. Hardy rubber tree might be a good choice too. New York City has been working with it as a street tree for a while now. Kind of upright, relatively clean. It has a small, the fruit is a small, dry, winged seed, but you know, you get some on the ground, but it's not like it's a pod that's going to squish. You know, they sort of just sweep right up or blow away.
And Sam, I was wondering, like, do you also consider any wildlife, like insects, you know, and birds, you know, like selecting trees that can, you know, really help, you know, these little friends as well in urban environments?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the problem you run into is, like, you know, to any tree for them is better than none. You know, and then natives will work better than non-natives to support the population that's there. But there's some debate about, you may have heard of one particular scientist named Doug Tallamy in his book, his string of books now, Bringing Nature Home, about how important oaks are to support the ecosystem. You know, so first you got to get the trees. You try for natives, and then you try for a good variety from that. But realistically, you know, if you can't get the trees past the business improvement project, that's not doing anything any good at all. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that really springs to mind for your site.
I will actually reach out.
I'd have to think a little more, but
yeah, I think, you know, we had good recommendations list, but it's always interesting, you know, to involve, you know, everybody has different interests and reasons, and it's important to listen to both businesses, but also residents, and we really, you know, have the need to create something that's not only beautiful, but you know, just more shade providing, because that's very important, especially as the temperatures are changing. And can I ask you a last question? I don't know if somebody else would like to ask. I don't want to dominate this conversation, but I have so many questions. What are your thoughts on metal tree grades? You know, like the ones that are like installed flush on the sidewalk. I know that New York City has a ban on them. They're not being installed anymore because they've been preventing the trees from growing. Is that still the case?
Yeah. They were nothing but a problem
Metal
in
tree
New York
grade.
City.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for the same, you know, for the same money or even less, you're much better getting a tree guard, one of those fences that goes around the tree.
Okay.
And because the grates, in part, they often got put in by a private property owner, and then the tree grew into them, and they became a huge problem when the tree died and the city had to take it out, or they were killed. They killed a lot of trees too because they grew into them and it just choked the tree to death.
Yeah. Okay.
Over time, you know, if the frame they were in and also everything got damaged, I mean, anything can do this, but they'd wind up with like a corner of the grate sticking up, and then they became a tripping hazard as well.
Well, I have to say that New York City has done incredible job with the trees. You know, I worked in downtown and I've seen huge improvements even in Midtown. So, you know, fantastic work, you know, and I guess thank you to former Mayor Bloomberg for really starting that initiative and a lot of volunteer groups.
Oh, thank you. I will let our friends at the Parks Department know too.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. And I think we can end it here. Thank you so much, Sam. This was really great. A great kickoff to a 2022 season where I hope we all can kind of help out, do our best to make sure our respective cities are doing the right thing around trees.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you,
night.
Sam and Aaron. Thank you very much.
Thank you.